Not every locked door has a "Do Not Enter" sign on it. Some places are guarded by soldiers, some by governments who won't even admit what's inside, and some, somehow, are guarded by snakes. But they all share one thing: you are not getting in, no matter how much money or curiosity you bring with you. So here are 17 places on Earth the public has been banned from visiting. Number 17, Vozrojdeniya Island, Uzbekistan. Vozrojdeniya Island used to sit in the middle of the Aral Sea, right on the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and for most of the Cold War, it was one of the most tightly kept secrets in the entire Soviet Union. Starting in 1948, the USSR built a facility here codenamed Aralsk 7 and used the island's isolation to openly test some of the deadliest biological weapons ever developed, including anthrax, plague, smallpox, brucellosis, and tularemia. A small military town called Kantubek grew up around the lab, housing around 1,500 scientists, soldiers, and their families, complete with its own school and post office, all quietly supporting one of the largest bioweapons programs in human history. In 1971, a field test of weaponized smallpox went wrong and caused an actual outbreak in the nearby city of Aralsk, killing 3 people, an incident the Soviets managed to keep hidden for decades. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the facility was abandoned almost overnight, and up to 200 tons of anthrax slurry was reportedly dumped and buried in a pit on the island, rather than properly disposed of. Here's the twist nobody planned for. The Aral Sea itself, drained for decades by Soviet irrigation projects, kept shrinking, and Vozrojdeniya eventually stopped being an island at all, connecting to the mainland by the early 2000s. That turned a formerly isolated biohazard site into something rodents and scavengers could simply walk into, which is exactly the kind of plot twist you don't want in a story about buried anthrax. Number 16, Poveglia Island, Italy. Poveglia sits quietly in the Venetian lagoon, just a short boat ride from the tourists snapping photos in St. Mark's Square, and its reputation is about as far from a Venetian postcard as you can get. During outbreaks of the plague in the 1600s and 1700s, Venice used the island as a quarantine station, and later, when other quarantine sites overflowed, as a dumping ground for the sick and the dying. Some estimates put the number of plague victims buried or cremated on the island at over 100,000, and locals have long claimed the soil itself is partly made of human ash. In the early 20th century, the island took an even darker turn, becoming home to a mental hospital where, according to persistent stories, a doctor performed crude experimental procedures on patients. The hospital eventually closed, and the island was left to crumble. For decades afterward, the Italian government simply prevented anyone from setting foot on it, officially citing the danger posed by collapsing, unmaintained buildings. More recently, there's been a shift. In 2025, a group of local activists secured a 99-year lease to turn part of Poveglia into a public park for Venice residents, which is a genuinely happy update for a place with such a grim history. But the interior of the old asylum and much of the rest of the island remains structurally unsafe and off-limits. So for now, Poveglia stays mostly what it's been for a century, a place you can see but not really visit. Number 15, Pangar Fort, India. Pangar Fort was built in the late 1500s in what's now the Indian state of Rajasthan, commissioned by a Rajput king for his son, and for a while it was a genuinely thriving fortified town, full of markets, temples, and palaces. Today, all of that is roofless and crumbling, and the Archaeological Survey of India has posted an official sign at the entrance stating that entering the fort's grounds before sunrise or after sunset is strictly prohibited, with legal action promised against anyone who ignores it. Officially, the ban exists for practical reasons. The fort sits right next to the Sariska Tiger Reserve, meaning wildlife can wander through after dark, and the site itself is unlit, uneven, and structurally unstable, which is a bad combination for anyone stumbling around after sunset. Unofficially, Pangar has a reputation as the most haunted site in India, with generations of local legends about curses, tragic princesses, and vengeful holy men supposedly explaining why the once thriving town was abandoned centuries ago? Whether or not you believe any of that, the ban is very real and very enforced, with local police actively patrolling the area to keep visitors out after dark. It's one of the only historical sites in the country where the official signage reads less like a museum plaque and more like the opening scene of a horror movie. Number 14. Lascaux Caves, France. Discovered by accident in 1940 when 4 teenagers and their dog stumbled into an opening in the French countryside, Lascaux turned out to contain one of the greatest collections of prehistoric art on the planet. Nearly 600 painted animals and human figures, along with roughly 1,500 engravings, all created around 17,000 years ago. When it opened to the public in 1948, it quickly became one of the most popular archaeological sites in France, drawing well over 1,000 visitors a day at its peak. That popularity turned out to be the problem. All those visitors were breathing, sweating, and radiating body heat into an enclosed cave system that had spent millennia in careful equilibrium. The carbon dioxide and humidity from human bodies began degrading the paintings, triggering the growth of lichen, then fungus, then a stubborn black mold that resisted most attempts to remove it. By 1963, the French government shut the cave to the public entirely, restricting access to a small number of researchers and conservators each year. Rather than let the public miss out entirely, French officials commissioned an extraordinarily detailed replica nearby, called Lascaux II, which opened in 1983, followed by even more advanced facsimiles in the years since. So today you actually can visit Lascaux in the sense that you can walk through a meticulously reproduced version of it. The real cave, with the real 17,000-year-old paint on its real walls, is sealed behind steel doors and has been for over 60 years. Number 13. Ise Grand Shrine, Japan. Ise Grand Shrine is technically open to the public, and millions of visitors make the pilgrimage to its forested grounds in Mie Prefecture every year. What you can't do, no matter how far you travel or how devout you are, is actually walk into the inner sanctuary. The shrine's main buildings, dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu and believed to house Japan's sacred mirror, one of the 3 imperial regalia, sit behind a series of tall wooden fences that block them almost entirely from view. Only members of the imperial family and a small number of senior Shinto priests are permitted past those fences. Everyone else, tourists and pilgrims alike, has to settle for approaching the outermost gate and glimpsing a thatched roofline over the top of the barriers. Photography of the main shrine buildings isn't allowed either, which only adds to the mystery. What makes Ise even stranger is that the buildings you're not allowed to properly see are torn down and rebuilt from scratch every 20 years, in a ritual called Shikinen Sengu that's been carried out for over 1,300 years, using construction techniques passed down generation to generation specifically so the tradition never dies out. So in a sense, no version of the inner shrine is ever more than 2 decades old, and no outsider has ever really seen any of them up close. Number 12. Chapel of the Tablet, Aksum, Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, the biblical container said to hold the original 10 Commandments, has been resting inside a small chapel in the ancient city of Aksum for well over 1,000 years. The story goes that Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, brought it there himself, and the Ethiopian church has guarded it ever since inside a modest structure called the Chapel of the Tablet. Here's the catch. Nobody outside the church is allowed to see it. Access is restricted to a single monk, known as the Guardian of the Ark, who is chosen for life and, once appointed, is never permitted to leave the chapel grounds again. When that guardian dies, he traditionally names his own successor before passing, continuing an unbroken chain of solitary custodianship. Even the head of the Ethiopian church isn't allowed inside to view the object. Researchers and historians have spent decades asking for even limited access, hoping to settle the question of what's actually inside once and for all, and they've been turned down every time. A British officer named Edward Ullendorf claimed to have glimpsed something inside the church during a wartime visit in the 1940s, but by most accounts what he saw was a ceremonial replica, not the object itself. The real one, if it exists at all, has stayed exactly where tradition says it's supposed to stay, seen by one man at a time for centuries. Number 11. Snake Island, Brazil. Ilha da Queimada Grande sits about 20 miles off the coast of São Paulo, and from a distance it looks like a perfectly pleasant little island, covered in forest, ringed by clear water. It is not pleasant. It is home to somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 golden lancehead pit vipers, a species found absolutely nowhere else on Earth, packed into just a few dozen acres of habitat, at a density that works out to roughly one snake for every few hundred square feet of forest floor. These vipers evolved in isolation after rising sea levels cut the island off from the Brazilian mainland around 11,000 years ago. With no ground-based predators around and only migratory birds to hunt, the golden lancehead developed venom several times more potent than its mainland relatives, fast-acting enough to kill a bird almost instantly before it can fly off and die somewhere else. That same venom is capable of causing severe internal bleeding in a human and can kill within an hour if left untreated. Because of the obvious risk, the Brazilian Navy banned public access to the island back in the 1920s and has never reopened it. The only people who legally set foot there now are scientists with special government permits, and even they typically travel with a doctor on board the boat, just in case. It remains one of the very rare places on the planet where humans are locked out specifically to protect a predator from us, rather than the other way around. Number 10. North Sentinel Island, India. North Sentinel Island sits in the Bay of Bengal as part of India's Andaman Islands, and it's home to the Sentinelese, a hunter-gatherer people believe to have lived in near-total isolation for tens of thousands of years. They have made their position on visitors extremely, unambiguously clear: stay away or be met with arrows. The Indian government has responded by making contact with the island effectively illegal. Under a law dating back to 1956, no one, Indian citizen or foreign national, is allowed within several nautical miles of the shore, and the Navy patrols the surrounding waters specifically to enforce it. The reasoning cuts both ways. The Sentinelese have no immunity to common outside diseases like the flu or measles, meaning even a friendly visit could accidentally wipe out the tribe, while the tribe's own well-documented history of repelling outsiders by force makes any landing genuinely dangerous for the visitor too. That danger isn't hypothetical. Fishermen who drifted too close have been killed in the past, and in 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow paid local fishermen to take him near the island, ignored repeated warnings, and was killed shortly after reaching the shore. His body was never recovered. As one anthropologist who'd actually met the Sentinelese decades earlier put it afterward, the tribes of these islands don't need outsiders to protect them. What they need is to be left alone. Number 9. Svalbard Global Seed Vault, Norway. Built into a mountainside on the remote Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, deep inside the Arctic Circle, the Global Seed Vault exists as a kind of backup hard drive for global agriculture. It currently holds well over 1 million seed samples from crops all over the world, submitted by countries and gene banks as insurance against the possibility that war, disaster, or simple mismanagement wipes out their own collections back home. Despite its nickname, the Doomsday Vault, it wasn't actually built with civilization's collapse in mind so much as everyday, unglamorous emergencies. It's already been used once for exactly that purpose, when researchers whose seed bank in Syria was disrupted by war were able to withdraw duplicate samples they'd deposited years earlier. But regardless of the reason for a visit, almost nobody gets one. The vault is protected by motion detectors, reinforced steel doors, and a strict list of authorized personnel that includes government officials, scientists, and vault staff, and essentially nobody else. Tourists can walk up to the outside of the facility and take a photo of its now iconic entrance jutting out of the snowy mountainside. But that's where the trip ends. Letting in visitors, even well-meaning ones, would introduce exactly the kind of contamination risk the entire vault was built to guard against. So the inside of the mountain remains reserved for a very short, very specific guest list. Number 8. Niihau, Hawaii. Niihau sits just 17 miles off the coast of Kauai, and for over 150 years it's been known across Hawaii as the Forbidden Island. The Robinson family purchased it from the Hawaiian monarchy back in 1864, reportedly for $10,000 in gold, with a promise to the king at the time that they would preserve the island's traditional Hawaiian culture and protect its people. The family has stuck to that promise in a fairly extreme way ever since. Access has been restricted for well over a century, and the ban tightened further in the 1930s, when officials worried about outbreaks of diseases like measles and polio reaching the island's isolated population. Even today, nobody can set foot on Niihau without permission from the Robinson family, and that includes relatives of the people who actually live there. Residents get by without cars, electricity, or running water, generally traveling by horse or bicycle, and Niihau remains the only place in Hawaii where the Hawaiian language is still the primary one spoken day to day. In recent years, the family has started offering extremely limited, tightly controlled helicopter day tours, letting a small number of visitors land on the beach for a few hours under close supervision, with contact between guests and residents kept to a minimum. It's a small crack in a door that's been closed for a century and a half, but the island as a whole remains just as off-limits as its nickname suggests. Number 7. Diego Garcia, British Indian Ocean Territory. Diego Garcia is the largest island in the Chagos Archipelago, a remote cluster of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and today it houses one of the most strategically important American military bases anywhere in the world, complete with runways long enough to land B-52 bombers. To build that base, the British government forcibly removed the island's entire population, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people, between the late 1960s and 1973. The displaced Chagosians, many of them descendants of enslaved plantation workers, were relocated mostly to Mauritius and the Seychelles with little to no support, and many ended up living in poverty. For decades afterward, they fought through British courts for the right to return home, winning rulings that were then overturned on appeal again and again. One Chagosian who was finally allowed a brief, supervised visit decades later described walking past his family's old graves with a massive American base looming behind them, saying it made him feel ashamed that people from every corner of the world were working there, and none of them were Chagosian. In 2024, Britain agreed to transfer sovereignty of the wider Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius, which was seen as a step toward justice after decades of pressure. But Diego Garcia itself was carved out of that deal, remaining under a 99-year lease to the United States and the United Kingdom, which means the Chagosians are still barred from the one island in their homeland they actually want back. Number 6. Woomera Prohibited Area, Australia. Covering roughly 127,000 square kilometers of remote South Australian outback, an area close to the size of England, the Woomera Prohibited Area is the largest land-based weapons testing range on Earth. It was established in 1947 as a joint project between Britain and Australia, giving the British a place to test long-range missiles far from anyone who might complain about the noise. And it quickly grew into one of the busiest rocket launching sites on the planet, second in launch frequency for a time only to NASA's operations at Cape Canaveral. Between 1955 and 1963, part of the range, at a site called Maralinga, was used for a series of British nuclear weapons tests, adding a permanent radioactive legacy to an already restricted stretch of desert. Today, entry is tightly controlled by the Royal Australian Air Force, with clearly defined zones that can be closed off entirely, sometimes for months at a time, whenever live testing is underway. The area is also home to significant Aboriginal cultural heritage, with several Indigenous groups holding either freehold title or native title rights across large sections of the prohibited zone, meaning the restrictions layer government secrecy on top of much older claims to the same land. Access today is occasionally granted to mining companies and research groups under strict permits, but for ordinary members of the public, this is one line on the map you simply cannot cross. Number 5. Mezhgory, Russia. Mezhgory is a small, unremarkable-looking town tucked into the southern Ural Mountains, and by Russian law, it's what's known as a closed administrative territorial formation, meaning nobody can enter or even stay overnight without special government authorization. What makes it interesting isn't the town itself, but the enormous mountain looming next to it, Mount Yamantau, whose name translates roughly to Bad Mountain in the local Bashkir language, which honestly feels like foreshadowing. Construction on a massive facility inside Yamantau reportedly began back in the 1970s under Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and continued for decades, surviving the collapse of the USSR and the economic chaos of the 1990s completely intact. American satellite imagery throughout that period showed enormous excavation efforts, involving what's believed to be tens of thousands of workers burrowing deep into the mountain's rock. Some estimates put the finished complex at up to 400 square miles in size, roughly comparable to the city of Washington, D.C., with tunnels reportedly descending thousands of feet underground. Russian officials have never given a straight answer about what the facility is actually for, at various points suggesting it's a mine, a storage depot, or a vault for national treasures. American analysts have long suspected it's a hardened bunker meant to keep senior leadership alive in the event of a nuclear war. Whatever the real purpose, Mezhgory remains completely closed to outsiders, and Mount Yamantau has earned itself an unofficial nickname among Western observers, Russia's Area 51. Number 4. RAF Menwith Hill, England. Tucked into the Yorkshire countryside, surrounded by sheep pastures and stone walls, sits one of the largest electronic intelligence gathering stations on the planet. RAF Menwith Hill is officially a Royal Air Force base, but it's operated primarily by the United States National Security Agency, and it's instantly recognizable from a distance thanks to dozens of enormous white geodesic domes rising out of the fields, each one shielding a satellite dish from view. The site dates back to the early 1950s, when it began as a relatively modest radio listening post, but it expanded dramatically over the following decades into a key node in a global signals intelligence network shared between the United States, the United Kingdom, and several allied nations. Its exact capabilities remain classified, though it's widely believed to intercept satellite communications, phone calls, and internet traffic on a massive scale, and it has occasionally drawn protests from privacy campaigners and local activists who've camped outside its perimeter fence for years at a time. Unsurprisingly, the base itself is completely off-limits to the public, ringed by fencing, checkpoints, and armed security, with access restricted to cleared personnel from the militaries and intelligence agencies involved. From the outside, all most people ever see are those strange white domes glowing on the horizon, giving no hint of what, exactly, is being listened to underneath them. Number 3. Fort Knox, Kentucky. Everyone knows the name Fort Knox as shorthand for maximum security, and the reputation is well earned. The United States Bullion Depository, built there in 1936 using thousands of tons of granite, concrete, and structural steel, has held a significant chunk of America's gold reserves since 1937, and the facility takes its no visitors policy about as seriously as a policy can be taken. In its entire history, the vault has reportedly been opened for outside eyes only a handful of times. President Franklin D. Roosevelt inspected it in 1943. A group of journalists and members of Congress were given a carefully staged tour in 1974, largely to quiet public rumors that the gold had quietly been sold off. And in 2017, then Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin paid a visit alongside Kentucky's governor. Outside of those rare, tightly managed exceptions, nobody outside authorized Treasury and military personnel gets past the gates, and there hasn't been a comprehensive independent audit of the gold's exact weight since 1953. That secrecy has fueled plenty of speculation over the decades, from conspiracy theories claiming the vault is emptier than officials admit, to more recent political calls for a live, televised inspection to settle the question once and for all. As of now, none of that has actually happened, and the vault remains exactly what it's always been: a building almost nobody living has ever seen the inside of. Number 2. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center, Virginia. Hidden inside a mountain in the Blue Ridge Range of Virginia, roughly 50 miles from Washington, D.C., Mount Weather is one of the United States government's key continuity of government facilities, built to keep federal leadership functioning if the Capitol itself were ever destroyed or made unreachable. Construction on the underground complex began in the 1950s, during the height of Cold War fears about a Soviet nuclear strike, and it's been continuously maintained and upgraded ever since. Officially, Mount Weather operates under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and its publicly acknowledged role involves coordinating disaster response and maintaining backup infrastructure for the federal government. Unofficially, and according to numerous leaked reports over the decades, the underground facility is believed to include everything a functioning shadow government might need: office space, dormitories, a reservoir, a crematorium, and hardened communications equipment designed to keep senior officials connected to the outside world, no matter what happened above ground. The site made brief, unwanted headlines in 2011 when a small plane crash near the perimeter accidentally drew public attention to how heavily guarded the area actually was. Beyond incidents like that, Mount Weather stays almost entirely out of the news, and the public has essentially no legal way to see the inside of it. It exists specifically for a catastrophe most people would never want to witness anyway, on the theory that some doors should only ever open when everything else has already gone wrong. Number 1. Area 51, Nevada. No list like this one could end anywhere else. Area 51 sits inside a stretch of Nevada desert called the Nevada Test and Training Range, and it began in the 1950s as a classified testing site for the CIA's U-2 spy plane, chosen specifically because it was remote enough that a highly experimental aircraft could be flown without drawing attention. Over the following decades, it went on to host testing for the SR-71 Blackbird, early stealth aircraft, and reportedly a long list of other programs the government has never fully acknowledged. For most of its existence, the US government wouldn't even confirm the base existed at all, despite the fact that its outline was clearly visible on commercial satellite maps for years. That total silence, combined with the site's habit of testing genuinely strange-looking experimental aircraft over the open desert, is largely what fed decades of UFO folklore, alien conspiracy theories, and government cover-up stories that turned a fairly ordinary military flight test facility into arguably the most famous secret location on the planet. Access today remains exactly as restricted as ever. The perimeter is marked by motion sensors, cameras, and warning signs explicitly stating that deadly force is authorized against trespassers, and the surrounding hills are reportedly monitored by private security contractors locals have nicknamed Camo Dudes, who show up within minutes of anyone getting too close. In 2019, a Facebook joke event calling for a mass raid on the base to "see them aliens" attracted millions of online signups and made international news, though in the end, only a few hundred curious people actually showed up near the gates, and absolutely nobody got inside. The government, for what it's worth, still isn't saying much. 17 places, guarded by armies, tribes, snakes, mountains, and monks, and every single one of them sends the same message: you can look, but you cannot go in. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these you'd risk it to sneak into. See you in the next video.